So let's um, how- let's start by looking into the traditional application architecture as we have seen it uh, in traditional client server applications. So this is a typical example of three-tier architecture, and what you have there is essentially a presentation tier followed by a middle tier, which the presentation layer is going to talk to, and then you have a database tier which involves all your databases. And typically the technologies of choice would be for the presentation tier uh, Java in the form of Java Server Pages, or if you're on the Microsoft platform you will have ASP.NET or ASP.NET MVC, and in the middle tier you will have Java, again J2E, again if you are on the Microsoft stack you would have .NET WCF services, which are in turn going to talk to databases like SQL Server, Oracle database, or if you are on the open source world, you will be using MySQL database. Now, if you notice that in this typical three-tier architecture, your middle tier will communicate with your presentation tier using XML or SOAP. SOAP is also a sort of an enhanced form of XML. And your databases will be relational databases. So whether it's Oracle or SQL Server or MySQL, all of them are relational databases which force you to store your data in the form of tables, right, rows and columns. And this has been the application architecture for a fairly long time, and it has evolved a lot in the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years. Most of the applications that you would encounter would follow this kind of an architecture or some kind of variation of this architecture. However, things are changing, especially in the last 5 to 6 years, and here is what has changed. One is new devices like smartphones, tablets, various other devices which now communicate and send and receive data. Uh, Browser capabilities have become extremely enhanced. There was a time when browsers were only capable of downloading HTML pages, but now browser capabilities have evolved a lot, and they are able to do a lot of other things. Examples are Chrome's V8 engine, which is the JavaScript processing engine of Chrome. You have the Chakra engine in IE10 and Edge browsers. Most of these browsers have evolved native JSON processing, which is JavaScript object notation, and we'll talk a bit about it. Apart from that, browsers nowadays are capable of storing data as key value pairs in session storage and local storage, and they also support databases like IndexedDB. All these capabilities are also related to the advancements in HTML5, and they have been added to the browsers in the last 5 to 6 years. The other trend that has happened is the rise of the scripting clients. So lots of frameworks have been developed using JavaScript, and those frameworks have contributed in shifting the way the tiered or the n-layered architecture is defined. Of course, we know that JavaScript object notation or JSON has become the de facto standard as far as consumption of database is concerned, and it has its advantages in terms of small, lightweight footprint. It is highly scalable. It has a document format, and essentially you can create key value pairs, right? And last but not the least, the change that has happened is the shift from relational to non-relational databases. So when we looked at the previous architecture, we looked at databases that were relational databases, which basically meant that you are storing data in the form of tables, rows, and columns, whereas now databases have the capability to store data as mere documents. So essentially aggregates of information which don't prescribe to a specific schema. And that is what NoSQL databases are all about. Now all these changes have happened parallelly without anyone orchestrating them. It's just a coincidence that all of these changes have happened, but they have had a profound impact on how you would architect your applications. So this has what it has led to. Your presentation tier has now changed from your traditional server-side technologies to frameworks like AngularJS, React, Knockout, etc., which communicate to a middle tier, which is, if you are still using proprietary systems, you would be using probably like Spring, not J2E, but probably Spring. You would be using ASP.NET Web API. And of course, you have Node.js with Express. And the data format, the format in which the presentation layer would exchange data with the middle tier is now JSON. It's no longer XML and so. And the middle tier then goes to the database tier, and while the relational databases are still supported, you also have a new class of databases called NoSQL databases like MongoDB, Couchbase, which store data in the form of JSON or binary JSON. Right? So MongoDB stores data in the form of binary JSON, and proprietary databases like SQL Server, Oracle, etc., they would store data in some proprietary binary format. So this is where the technology shift has happened across each of the tiers of your architecture. And this represents the full stack of development. So if you're looking at full stack development, you can clearly see, if I go back to my previous slide, that the server-side technologies, all these technologies like ASP.NET, JSP, etc., they're all server-side technologies, right? Your browser sends a request to the web server takes the request, passes it on to the appropriate provider, which could be ASP.NET, which could be Java Server Pages, whatever it is, and that provider is going to do the heavy lifting of converting that request into an HTML document and then sending it back to the browser. So the entire processing is happening on the server. But with the new full stack that has been created, which has scripting clients, JavaScript clients like AngularJS, Knockout, etc., they are not sending everything. They're not sending the request onto the server and waiting for HTML to come back. They are sending requests in the form of JSON wherever required to a RESTful API, and then they are simply doing the data binding on the client, which is the browser itself. So the data manipulation and the manipulation of HTML is happening on the client itself. The server is no longer responsible for spitting out the HTML. And on the data layer, you have your NoSQL databases, which are supporting the data persistence. So what is full stack development? So any layer, the ability to sort of develop any layer across the technology stack. You could be on the presentation layer, you could be on the middle tier, you could be developing APIs, etc. Or you could be on the back end, that is databases, and you could be developing a MongoDB database and sort of doing the operations on top of it. It's a breadth role with depth in one or more areas. So it's a full stack developer is one who can work on each of the areas of the stack, of the technology stack, and has a depth or expertise in one or more of those areas. And why it is important is because if you look at the modern way of building software, we are shifting more and more towards agile. And in agile, you don't have very large teams. You have a small two pizzas teams with 4 to 9 people, a bunch of developers and QA. And if you have expertise in working, or if you have intermediate level expertise at least in working across the layer of the technology stack, then you can essentially be useful. Then you can work on pretty much all the areas, and not just the UI, or not just the backend, or not just the middleware. And you don't have to wait for anyone, unlike in a traditional development mode, where a UI developer finishes his work and then waits for the backend developer to sort of finish up the backend and give him the response. If you're a full stack developer, then you can go ahead and create the backend, part of the backend yourself. So let's now go and check out some of the trends that have some of the technology trends. So this is data from Google. If you look at Google Trends and compare .NET with Node.js over the last 5 years, this is what you would get to look at. You will see that distinctly. I've chosen .NET Framework just as a reference. You could choose anything else, but you can see a distinct fall in the interest of people who are searching for .NET, and there is a distinct rise in people who are searching for Node.js. So it basically is an indicator that technologies like Node.js are picking up. If you compare them with more traditional client-server sort of technologies like .NET. That doesn't mean that .NET is going away anyway. It's going to stay there, but it just gives you a technical direction. So let's look at one more such trend. If you look at ASP.NET and you compare it with AngularJS, Google Trends will show you that AngularJS shows a very sharp rise over the last 5 years, whereas the interest of people worldwide in ASP.NET seems to be falling. That's as per the fact. This is dependent on a number of people searching for things like ASP.NET or AngularJS using the Google search engine. So you can go ahead and play around with the Google Trends and just compare the keywords and see what data comes out. And it's interesting to watch that this does show that there's a distinct move towards the interest in the developer community and generally software development to move more towards full stack development using technologies like Angular, Node, etc. So let's talk a little bit about what we will do in this full stack development course. What all things would we cover? So we'll cover AngularJS. We'll start with 1.6 version. This is for the entire course that we have. We cover Angular. We cover Express.js. Express.js is a middleware which provides which provides a way for you to build RESTful APIs which can communicate with the presentation using JSON objects. We'll cover Node.js in it. Node.js, as you know, is a non-blocking asynchronous I/O technology, which is entirely written, which runs on the Chrome's V8 engine. And we have a relational NoSQL database, MongoDB, which provides us a schema-less database to store data in JSON. And we'll talk about Mongoose ORM, which is a very popular Node module, which is used to communicate with a MongoDB database. And what it helps in is just like, you can think of it as a ORM tool like Entity Framework or nhibernate. So nhibernate can sort of create a set of entities on top of a database like MySQL. Entity Framework can create entities which you can utilize in your .NET code. You can sort of create those entities on top of your SQL Server database. Similarly, using Mongoose ORM, it's a more developer-friendly way of sort of accessing or interacting with your Mongoose database. So in the full stack development course, we focus on concepts and in-depth working. We will have live exercises and assignments which will eventually lead to a full-fledged application. And we'll cover on the concepts like which go behind the scenes, and we'll see how technologies like Angular or Node how they actually work behind the scenes and not just focus on the syntax. So with that, we can shift gears and jump into introduction to AngularJS. If anyone of you have any questions, you can put them on the chat window and I'll try to answer them.
Yeah, we can start.
Okay, so I think one of the questions is that are you going to cover Angular 2? So if you look at the current state in the market, you'll find that about 50 to 60%, I would say 60 to 70 actually, percent of the Angular projects are in Angular 1, various versions of Angular 1. And Angular 2 has been launched to production in September 2016, around about that point. It's a fairly involved exercise if one directly starts learning Angular 2. And Angular 2 has very high levels of abstraction, which are even more pronounced than what it used to be in Angular 1. So essentially, it's a big leap. If someone, it again depends on your existing level, but for a developer who has, let's say, a beginner level idea of JavaScript and frameworks like Angular, Node, etc., it's a fairly involved process to start with Angular 2. And even for an experienced developer, my recommendation would be to sort of go and learn AngularJS 1 or whatever is the latest version, I think it's 1.6. Learn that first and then move over to Angular 2, because many of the concepts like scope, components, etc., which are abstracted out in Angular 2 are available for the developer to create in Angular 1. So it sort of gives you a very good fundamental to understand what Angular is all about. And it's also going to be helpful in case you are working on a project which involves you to migrate an application from Angular 1 to Angular 2. Having said that, we'll surely touch about the benefits of Angular 2 and some of the important changes or differences that are there in Angular 2 as compared to Angular 1. So I hope that answers that question.
Can you show the trends between ASP.NET versus Node.js, right?
Yeah.
How is this with Java and JNTU technologies?
It would be on similar lines, but
Similar lines.
one has to check that.
Okay.
That's purely from Google Trends.
Okay.
Alrighty, so let's jump into introduction to AngularJS, and so let's start with a basic question. What is the need for AngularJS? Okay, I mean, why do we need a framework like AngularJS to be there in the first place? We already have JavaScript. JavaScript can do a bunch of things for me. I can create a form in HTML. I can validate it using JavaScript. I can submit it using JavaScript. So what's the big deal? So the question here is, or the answer rather lies in the size and complexity of your code. If you are purely working with HTML and JavaScript, and if you try to do all of the processing on the client side with JavaScript, eventually you'll end up writing code where you'll have lots of HTML with lots of JavaScript. And I'm sure you must have seen applications like that, and I have seen a lot of such applications where you have a lot of JavaScript code which is mixed with HTML code or some kind of a markup. It could be a ASP.NET markup or maybe on the Java side as well. And even if you separate out your JavaScript code in separate JS files and include them, you would still, that's a slightly better way of organizing your code, but it still doesn't take care of complexity. Because over a period of time, your code is going to become very, very complex, right? And that complexity is very hard to manage. And if you can imagine, I don't have the graph for it or the diagram for it, but if you put size on the y-axis and complexity on the x-axis, as your complexity increases, your size of your code also increases along with it. So it's basically very linear. There are other reasons why you would need a framework like AngularJS. But before we go into that, let's understand why does code become complex. A code becomes complex when you write code in a way where you cannot reuse the functions or behaviors that have been written. Right? And that's a very common scenario. Let's say you have a large project and somebody came in and wrote a code which sends an email, so sort of an email functionality, but it was hidden in some kind of a Java file, or it is hidden in some ASP.NET page or something like that, right? And another developer wanted to use the same functionality, so he writes the same code elsewhere. Right? That's a sort of a trivial example, but the point I'm trying to make it that you can extrapolate this example, and you'll find that in a large project there can be a lot of functionality that gets repeated, right? And that is what makes code complex. If your code has poor documentation, if your code has no code comments, that is also something which makes code complex, because it's difficult to understand what the developers have tried to achieve, right? Things like lack of single responsibility. Single responsibility is a principle where you write code in such a manner that one unit of code only does one thing. A good example of this would be, let's say you are writing a class, right? Or let's say you have a requirement where you have to capture data. Let's assume, for the sake of simplicity, that it is a string data, so it's basically text, right? So let's say you have to read a file and then encrypt its contents using some encryption algorithm, and then compress it using some compression logic, and then send it, right? Now if you write a class and one method in it called process, right, and in that same one method, if you do all of these actions, right, in that one method you read the file, you compress its, encrypt its contents, and you also encrypt it and send it across. That's a clear lack of single responsibility, because what you're doing is that you are doing many things in the same block of code, and eventually that code is going to become very complex because your encryption logic might change, right? Instead of one encryption logic, you might want to write two encryption logic, right? Two different algorithms. So you will put an if condition there and write one sort of logic in one block and another sort of logic in another block, right? And that is going to make your code complex. Similarly, you can have various complex, various scenarios, and you will keep modifying that piece of code. So it is this lack of single responsibility which makes code complex. Right? Low cohesion. Cohesion is again a quality of code, and this is general. It's not necessarily restricted to JavaScript, but it's a general point about programming. in general that similar functions or similar behaviors should be grouped in a single block of code. So if you are dealing with, let's say, string manipulation, right? You should write all that code in a single class instead of sort of messing it up around multiple places. High coupling is again a good design, code design point where you want your code to be it should actually be low coupling, because you would want your high cohesion and low coupling. I'm sorry for that, the points got interchanged. You want your coupling to be loose, so you want to create or write code in a manner so that it is loosely coupled, right? You don't want your code to be dependent on something to be present for it to execute. But the lack of all of this makes code complex, right? And a lot of these complexities you have to manage on your own if you are doing everything from scratch. And to manage all of that, to manage all this complexity, to give you a sort of a guardrails which you can follow to write code in a way that it is loosely coupled, it is high cohesion, it has proper single responsibility, and it can do a lot of heavy lifting on your part or on your behalf. We have the framework called AngularJS, right? And that's where the AngularJS framework comes in. So let's look at a few of the basic patterns or principles in AngularJS. One of the patterns which Angular uses is MV star pattern, right? It's you can replace the star with pretty much anything you want. AngularJS, the creators of AngularJS call it MV whatever pattern. So it could be MVVM, it could be MV controller, MVC, or whatever else. The second thing that we'll look at is immediately invoked function expressions. This is a specific concept in JavaScript which is crucial in building controllers in AngularJS. We'll also look at a simple AngularJS app, and we'll also see how Angular actually resolves all these dependencies. So first let's talk about the model view model, or MVVM. So essentially what it is, it's a design pattern which is followed by most of the single page application libraries, specifically AngularJS. So what the essential components of this pattern is a model, then you have the view, and then you have the view model. So the model represents your data, right? So in any application you would need to show some data, right? It could be user information, it could be some kind of other data that you want to show and manipulate, you want to capture data from the input from the user. All of that goes into the model, right? And it can also contain some logic to retrieve the data from some kind of a source, and that source, in terms of, if you think in terms of AngularJS or JavaScript framework, it would be some sort of an API, and that API would be giving you an endpoint that you're going to query and then get some data out of it in the JSON format. However, the key thing about model is that it contains no logic associated for the display part. The model is completely unaware how that data is going to be displayed. It only knows what data it is encapsulating and providing to the other layers of the architecture. Next comes the view. Depending on where you are using this, in terms of JavaScript app, or a web application, a view is nothing but a combination of HTML and CSS. And you would have guessed it by now that it is essentially nothing but the display of data, and also if you want to manipulate it, right? But it never changes the data. So the view is not really going to change data. It is not going to change the schema of the model. It's only going to consume the model in whatever shape it gets it. It is neither going to add anything to the object, nor it is going to remove anything from the object. Let's say if you have, to give an example, if you have a model that that emulates your user information. So you will have a first name, a last name, probably an email address, right, and maybe a phone number. A model is the one that will hold the data for that, right, and the view is going to sort of display that data and also capture, if you want the user to input anything. But it is not going to change the properties of this model. It is not going to add a new property to this. It is not going to say that, okay, now we'll add a new property called maybe address or city or state. That is not the job of the view. So essentially, it is never going to change that data. It can definitely broadcast events, right? But it never handles those events. That's another key point. When you want to talk about view, obviously it will. The view is what the user is going to interact with. So there will be button clicks, there will be drop-down changes, things like that. So it will raise those events, but the view will not handle it. So who's going to handle those events and who's going to change the data? That is the job of the view model. And view model is a sort of a loose term here. It could be a controller also if you're following the MVC pattern. So like I said, MV whatever. AngularJS is more of a MV whatever. So the model is static, the view is static, but the other part, based on your convenience, you can refer to it as a view model or a controller or whatever else you want to call it. Right? So what does a view model do? Essentially represents the state of the view, right? Because it's responsible for capturing the data from the view. It is responsible for responding to the events which are generated by the view. It could be a button click, it could be a whatever event, right? And it is also responsible for holding the business logic, right? So let's say you're building a sort of a tax calculator. You want users to enter their salary and maybe a bunch of other things, age and all that, and you want to just calculate their tax. So the calculation logic could be in your controller or view model, right? And it never asks the view to display anything, which is obvious because that's the job of the view itself. So this is the picture that can sort of capture how the MV star model looks in AngularJS. So on the view side, you have HTML and CSS. On the model side is where you have the data and a bit of business logic, and your presentation logic could be inside your view model, controller, whatever, right? And what glues together the view and the presentation logic, which could be controller or view model, is known as the data binding. Data binding is one of the features of AngularJS, which basically binds this model data to the view, so that it can be displayed and it can be captured from the user, etc. And there are different kinds of bindings, like one-way binding, you have two-way binding, and also you have one-time binding. In the detailed course, we go into the depth of the data binding functionality. We discuss in detail what all the three kinds of data bindings and what impact does it have, because using data binding has a cost. Every time you bind data with a view, AngularJS, especially if it's a two-way binding, AngularJS will run a digest cycle and it will check for changes in the data so that it can update the view. Right? So there's a cost to it, and it's a choice that one should make, knowing fully well what would be the impact on performance, etc. So in the full course, we sort of go into the depths of all these details. So let's now look at another concept in JavaScript, which is directly sort of a fundamental concept in declaring an Angular controller. And that is known as an immediately invoked function expression. In short, it is called as IFI. In the tech community, you call it as an IFI, and it's really very simple. Essentially, what an IFI is, it's essentially an anonymous function, and that is created and then immediately invoked. So basically, the general programming practice is to first create a function or a method and then call it. If you don't explicitly call a function, it will never get invoked, right? So let's say you created a function to calculate, let's say you had two parameters, A and B, and you had a function called add, which adds the two parameters and returns the result. Now, in your code, you will have to somewhere call this method called add. If you don't, it will never get executed. But here, the IFI is different. It's a function which, if you create it like an IFI or an immediately invoked function, it will get created and then it will be automatically invoked as well. Right? It's not called from anywhere because it's anonymous, and it just runs. And that is a fundamental concept which is used in creating controllers, and we'll see how. So let's do one thing. Let's jump into the code, right, and see how these concepts work. So let me end the presentation, I think, so that I can share the code editor. Oops. This message. Yeah. Okay. So will they also be able to see it? Yeah, they can be able to see. Yes. Good. So so I'm sharing my code editor screen, and if you're not able to see it, just let us know. So what I'm going to start with is a simple function. So what I've done here is that I've written a function. First of all, this is a JavaScript file, very simple file, and this has this is a common way of writing a function in JavaScript. This function does nothing. It simply prints a message onto the log, right? And what I've done is that I've created a file index.html, and inside that I'm going to call this script, right? So I'm going to add this script, and then there is a button, and that button has a click event which is going to say hello, which is what is the name of the function, right? So let's run this let me open the console so that you can see what this function does. So this function is printing this message which will say, I'll say hello to you and I'm not an IFI, right? So here's what it does, right? It's a very simple no nonsense kind of an approach. So it's a named function. You just have to sort of call it, and when you call it, it will display this message. And this is how a named function works. But what about an IFI? So this is the syntax of an IFI. So it's just two set of parentheses, right? And what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to write a function which says hi, right? Now I'm not going to invoke this function anywhere. So if you go back to my HTML, the button is the same, but I can actually remove this or comment this out so that there is no confusion. So let's refresh this window. Bingo. You get this message printed, right? So this is my function. It doesn't even have a name. It's an anonymous function, right? I never called it from anywhere. Unlike the previous case where I explicitly called this function on the click of a button, right? But in this case, in case of this, I did not even call it, but it still got executed and printed this message. Right? So this is what an immediately invoked function expression is. And in AngularJS, all controllers are created as an immediately invoked function expression, because you want your controllers to be loaded in memory before the view can use them. If your controllers are not loaded in memory, the dependencies will not resolve, because JavaScript is an interpreted language which basically executes line by line, right? So you don't want to run into a situation where you are trying to use a method which is declared in a controller, but it is not loaded in memory, right? Because if you do that, then you will get a undefined exception, right? Or whatever, not null reference or whatever you can call it. And therefore, this is a basic concept, important concept, which is used to define controllers in JavaScript, and this is known as an if. Right? So take a note of that, and what we'll do is we'll create a quick, we'll look at a simple AngularJS application. So this is what a simple AngularJS application looks like. I can actually write this again if you want me to, but it's pretty simple. What I want you to focus on is this part, right? So you can see that these are two sets of parentheses, right? So this is an if, and within that we have an anonymous function, which is where we are declaring our controllers, and where we are essentially not just declaring our controllers, but we are essentially initializing our Angular app, right, along with controllers and everything else, right? So this is how this is one way of declaring a controller, right? So the first thing is to use a method or function called module, right? And before that, I must tell you that I have downloaded angular.min.js. So you can go to Google and say download AngularJS, and it will take you straight to their page. So it's up to you. You can either consume their you can consume the CDN which Google provides, right? But the sake of our training, we will download AngularJS, from the Google website or the AngularJS website, and we'll use it locally. So you can download it from there. And I'm using Angular 1.6.2, right? The next thing I've done is I've created a page. It's a very simple page, right? And what it does is it basically adds a reference or adds the Angular script using the script tag. And then I have declared app.js, where I have declared my IFI, which we just talked about, and inside that I have created my anonymous function. Now inside this anonymous function, what I'm doing is I'm calling Angular global, global object that is made available to me by the Angular framework, AngularJS framework, and I'm calling the module function. I'm passing two parameters to it. One is the name of my module, and the other one is just a configuration parameter if I want to inject something. So for the sake of simplicity, for this particular session, we have left it blank. We have left it empty. It's essentially an array, right? And next what I do is I declare a controller with a dot controller syntax. This is a common sort of a practice, or you can say convention throughout Angular, that you first declare the name of the feature that you're using. It could be a controller, it could be a directive. As we go through the course, we'll see factory, etc. Right? That you declare it first, and then give it a name, and then provide the parameters. So this time I have provided two dependencies rather, which I want to use. One is the scope, which is again dollar scope, which is again an object which is provided by Angular, and we'll talk about what it gives us, but for the sake of simplicity, the second function is the function, the actual JavaScript function where I'll do my processing. So this is one way of writing this controller. You can also write it like this. You can say dot controller, and you could give it a name, right? And you could say the same thing, any dependencies that you want to use. And instead of writing the function, you could do this. You could take this function and give it here. So this is another way how you can declare a function. I prefer this approach because I find it a little cleaner as compared to this. The example that we are taking is a very trivial example where you just have a name property on the dollar scope, and therefore it doesn't make a difference. But if you can think of a more elaborate function, this syntax can become pretty messy, and can become a little more involved to understand as compared to this, right? So I prefer this syntax of declaring a controller as compared to this one, right? So let's talk a little bit about the dollar scope. Dollar scope is a service which is provided by AngularJS, right? And we'll talk about it in the detailed course that we hold. But for the sake of this seminar, you can think of it as a data context. It's a data context which will hold all the data that is required inside a controller. Right? So I can attach properties to this scope. I can say dollar scope dot email, for example. Right. Sorry. So I can say john.doe@gmail.com, whatever, right? And this is going to add this property and make it available throughout this controller. Right? So this is how my very simple controller looks like. So the steps are very self-explanatory. You first define an IFI inside this. You create an anonymous function. Within the anonymous function, you declare your module, right? Give a name to the module. If you want, you can add some dependencies, but for the sake of simplicity, we've kept an empty array. And then you declare your controller. You call the dot controller method. You give it a name, and then you inject your services that you need. For example, whatever it is, scope is a out-of-the-box service which Angular provides, which represents your data context. You can use other things like, for example, I can use dollar, where is that, filter. Dollar filter is again out-of-the-box service which Angular provides. It has a lot of things, like, for example, it has a capability of converting my text from uppercase to lowercase or lowercase to uppercase, right? So if I want to manipulate this text, I can use this built-in features, right? For now, I'm not using it, but you could specify that, and of course, you have to provide the function definition where you will be doing the actual work. All right. So once we have done this, we go back to our HTML, which is our view, right? And we have added our the JavaScript file where we have declared our Angular, initialized our Angular app, where we have declared our controllers, etc., and we invoke it. The next thing that you would sort of notice inside this particular view is the use of ng app. Right? So ng-app is a attribute which is mandated by AngularJS, and you equate it with the name of the module. So we named our module as my first app, right? And in the body we have specified the app name as my first app. So this name must match the name of the Angular module that you have declared, right? And then you can define any other HTML element. In this case, it's a div, and I'm associating this element with its controller. So this is the name of the controller again, right? And this is mapped to the ng controller. And what I have here is a simple input text box, right? And that input text box has ng model, right? Which is again another directive given by AngularJS, and it binds it to the name property, right? So we have the name property here, and we have bound it to ng model. What this syntax is going to do is that it is going to create a two-way binding, right? So whatever value this name property has, which in this case is John Doe, is going to show up in this text box. And because ng-model is a directive, it gives you two-way binding. Whatever we type in the text box is going to get reflected in the change of that property, right? In the next line, what we have is a display of that same property name. And I can actually also display the second property that we had, which is email, right? So let's run this application. Okay. I think this is not the folder. Yeah. So there you can see. So let me give a break here so that. Yeah. So we bound the scope, the name to this text box. Now it is visible, and you also have the email property. So if I change this from John Doe to John Smith, you can see that the value that we are printing here also gets changed. So this is what a two-way binding does. It is working two ways. Whatever we had initialized it with is also working, is also visible, and if we change it, the same change is reflected in the property. So we have learned a bunch of things here. What we have learned is how to sort of initialize your AngularJS code using a IFI. We have learned how to create a module, and we have learned how to create a controller, and how to use the scope in it. And we also learned how to define the HTML and how to associate it with your module and your controllers, and how to use your bindings. So that's quite a bit actually. Now, if you look carefully, you will see that none of these attributes that are here, ng app, ng controller, right, ng model, none of these are standard HTML attributes. Right? They are all attributes which have been given to us by Angular. They are all Angular directives. So how does Angular know? How does Angular know that it has to replace this name with whatever the value was? In our case, it was John Doe. How does it know that this is the controller that it has to associate with this particular div? How does it know that it has to initialize the app using this name? How does it find all of these and how does it match with what you have written in the JavaScript code? So let's go back to our basics example and have a look at that. So let me do this. Let me lift the wheel of magic and let's define an HTML page. Right. Let's say Angular dependency resolution. Let me put some code here to show you how this stuff works. So I have a very simple HTML page here. It just has a div tag, okay, which has an ID called target. Then it has an attribute called greeting, which has a value called hello. Right? And within that there is some other HTML5 tags. Now you must have noticed by now that ID is a valid HTML tag, right? But greeting is not a valid HTML tag. There is no tag, no attribute called greeting in HTML, right? But I have still put it, right? And let's see what we can do with JavaScript to actually figure out whether we can actually query this. So what we'll do is we'll put a script tag here and I'll use and I'll log this. So I'll log this whole thing to the console. So I'm doing a very simple thing here. I'm just trying to read this element that we have declared using its ID. And what I'm using here is the document object, which is a global object which is given us by JavaScript, right? And it will execute in every browser. So if we run this, in Chrome, so you will see that I have been able to extract the entire div element with all its HTML inside it, right? Using this particular method. Let's do one more thing. From this element that we have just extracted, let's call get attribute value, right? And what we are going to do here is we are going to say greeting. So if we refresh our page now, whoops, Okay, it's get attribute. So we get the value of this attribute that we have declared. This is a basic way of how you can traverse a DOM tree. So if you have an HTML document object model, it starts from your body HTML tag and then goes ahead all the way up to the head and the body, etc. JavaScript has built-in capabilities or methods that you can use to query different sections of your DOM, and then using that you can get the value of any attribute inside that DOM. So let's take a slightly more involved example than this, right? So what I'll do is I'll take another div, sorry, I'll place it here. Now what I'm doing is I'm writing sort of an Angular kind of a view where I have declared an ng app, right? Which is what is an Angular directive actually, and I have given it a name. Assume that you have Angular module declared by this name. So let's actually remove the ID tag, because this is how the real world would be. So in the real world, you will not have the ID for all the div elements or all the if you go back to the example that we used here, we had the ng app tag applied to the body, and it did not have any ID, right? So now what we do is we create another element, and so what we do is we call a function called query selector, right? And inside that query selector, we will provide the directive that we are searching for, okay? And then I'm just going to log this to the console. So if I execute it again, bingo, you get the entire div which had this attribute, right? So what query selector does, it's a built-in method of the document object. It is going to find the first occurrence in the entire DOM, in the entire document object model or the HTML tree that you have. It is going to find the first occurrence where this attribute is. In this case, it was ng-app, and it is going to pick that particular element, and it's going to give it back to you. So now what I'm going to do here, I'm going to take this up. I'm going to say get attribute so the value that I have put for this particular attribute is my test app. In the Angular world, it will be the name of the module, right? The name of the Angular module. So now, if I refresh this page again, I get the value. And this is exactly how the authors of AngularJS who have built this framework behind the scene. This is what they're doing to traverse the entire DOM and figure out the directives that they have defined. So they have defined directives like ng-app, ng-controller, ng-model, right? So what they are doing is, even though these are not standard HTML tags or attributes, but the authors or the creators of AngularJS framework, they are using advanced JavaScript inside the framework to figure out or select these elements and then traversing the DOM and doing the manipulation. And this is how AngularJS fundamentally works. And if I go back to our discussion on why you need a framework like AngularJS, if you did not have AngularJS, then you would have to write a lot of code like this. And this is a simple example to show how AngularJS is working, but you would have to write even more complicated code to actually figure out and manipulate the DOM objects. So this was an example of how AngularJS does its magic of sort of how does it know that ng app, how does it find where the ng app directive is and how it is associated with its this particular value, right? So now once it finds out this DOM object using JavaScript methods behind the scenes, it is very easy for AngularJS to create and associate, for example, a controller with this particular name, because that is already available in the JavaScript as a JavaScript object. Right? This whole immediately invoked function has created a module and a function, controller function, and it is now very easy. By the name, it can parse and match it with the script, and that's how it executes the entire functionality. Cool. So that is pretty much what I have for this seminar. We still have some time, so if you have any questions, you can put it on the chat window.
Or we can actually raise their hand, we can actually unmute them.
Yeah, you could also raise your hand on the platform. There is a icon which says raise your hand, and you could, and I will unmute you so that you can ask your question. Okay, a couple of people have raised their hands. Abhishek. Yeah, Abhishek. Yeah, I think if you have a question, you can put it on the chat window. Venu.
Yeah.
Yeah, Venu. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I need to learn AngularJS starting. Actually, I am a Salesforce developer.
Okay.
Okay. Compulsory, I need to learn this one, like JavaScript compulsory I need to learn, or directly I can learn this AngularJS.
So, okay. It is not an absolute necessity to learn JavaScript in order to learn AngularJS. But in our course, we do sort of cover the principles, the basic concepts that will be required to be used in AngularJS. So,
Okay.
that,
Principles in AngularJS, principles in JavaScript.
yeah, AngularJS is based on JavaScript. So having a good knowledge of JavaScript makes it easier for you to understand the kind of concepts which I just sort of displayed in our demo. You already know JavaScript. It is, you would be knowing concepts already. But in our course we do cover it, but it is not an absolute requirement.
Okay. Can you please share this video to us, all of us?
Yeah, sure. We can do that. I'll put that request to the organizers.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Ravi, are you there?
Yeah, I am there.
Yeah, Ravi, you have raised a hand. So, do you have any question?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to understand like this tutorial is good. I really liked it, but I wanted to know like nowadays Angular 2 is getting popular, and what I have seen in this tutorial is pretty good and have a like basic idea is clear. But what about the advanced topics like using custom filters and all the things?
Yeah. So, basically, you have two questions. I think one is Angular 2.
Mm-hmm.
The other one is about the advanced topics. So, because this is more of a seminar and an introduction, we have not covered the advanced topics here. In our full stack course, we cover both built-in functions as well as custom filters. We cover things like custom directives. We cover things like
Mm-hmm.
components. So we cover all the advanced features of Angular. On the question about Angular 2, I would sort of go back to the discussion which I had in the course of the presentation. Angular 2 is fairly
Mm-hmm.
new. What Google has done is that it has abstracted out a fair amount of things in Angular 2. So, for example, the scope, the dollar scope that we saw is now abstracted out. It's no longer there. Uh, and there are,
Okay, just just sorry to interrupt you. Like, would you suggest someone to go directly on Angular 2?
if you have already, if you are an advanced JavaScript developer, then yes. If you are a beginner, or if you only know Angular 1 but have not worked in a project, then I would suggest that it's better to understand Angular 1 and then go to Angular 2, because Angular 1 you will end up learning a fair amount of internals about how Angular works, and then Angular 2 becomes easier
Mm-hmm.
to complete.
Okay, and that's great. And what about like using a mean stack with Angular 1 or Angular 2?
So it's a slightly, I'll give you a slightly opinionated answer. There can be many answers to that. When you talk of mean stack, typically in our course will be covering the entire mean stack. So we'll have Express, which we'll use to build our REST API. We'll have MongoDB as our database,
Mm-hmm.
and of course we'll have an Angular front end. In general, for a full stack developer, all you care about is to build API, REST API that can serve data in the form of JSON, and your backend could be, it could be ASP.NET Web API, or it could be Spring, or some other, even Python. So any technology stack on the middle tier which can serve JSON, or which you can use to build RESTful APIs. Uh,
Okay, let's say ISP.NET Web API will provide you the REST service, and above of this we can do Angular 1 or 2 anything. Then mean stack is like we do not need mean stack in this case, right?
yeah, so that's a different technology stack, right? So it's a more of a hybrid or mixed technology stack that you're talking about.
Okay, okay, okay. So how do you see like mean stack will be growing in few years?
So I'll go back to I think it's part of the answer I gave in the slides. We were seeing the technology trends, right? So
Mm-hmm,
there-
correct,
there's a
correct.
there's a distinct rise in the interest level and also the usage of the mean stack. So it is going to it is going to become more popular. Um, at the same time, the other proprietary technologies will also continue to exist, because they have their own advantages. So
Correct.
they'll coexist. But yes, this is a skill which is going to be heavily in demand, and a lot of projects will continue to be built in this particular technology stack.
Mhm. Okay, okay. Thanks for giving answers. Yeah,
Cool.
that's all from my side.
Thank you, Ravi. So I'll move on to the next person. Okay, cool. So I think that's pretty much it. Anyone else who has a question can raise their hand.
So, Nitin, the kind of upcoming course, can you please throw some light on the kind of course that you are planning to put through? You already explained that. Kind of announcement.
Cool. So that's it, right?
Um, yeah, I think we're pretty much done. Yeah, I think there's one more question actually from Raymond.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Raymond.
Yeah, actually I need to ask, how is the AngularJS better than .NET in case of in performance or feature, and if suppose a person from .NET would like to shift to AngularJS, how easy it would be for him?
Okay. So I think the question is how easy it is for a person to shift from .NET to AngularJS, and there's another part to the question, which is to how performance-wise, how better is AngularJS as compared to .NET.
Yeah.
So AngularJS is a client-side framework, right? If I go back to the initial slides that we discussed, where we are talking about the application architecture and how it has changed over a period of time. AngularJS and frameworks like these, they are JavaScript frameworks which execute inside the client, which is the browser, right? Whereas technologies like ASP.NET or ASP.NET MVC, they're all server-side technologies where the processing is happening on the server, right? So it's like this. What has happened also over the years is that machines have become more powerful, right? It's now standard to have 8 GB RAM on most of your laptops. Earlier, you used to have 2 GB RAM, 256 or whatever, right? So machines have become more powerful. A lot of computing power is there in laptops and desktops, which has facilitated this kind of development using frameworks like JavaScript. And they are a thin client framework because browser is a thin client, right? You don't have to install anything. You are running everything from the web. You are downloading it once and running it. So if built properly with good architectural principles, Angular can be a very high performing, in fact, in some cases, even better performing as compared to an application built in, let's say, ASP.NET or server-side technologies. Because you are only concerned with fetching the data from your APIs, right? And the rendering is happening on the client side. So that is one way of looking at it. How easy it is for a .NET developer? Fairly easy, because if you are a .NET or a Java developer, you are pretty much exposed to the general programming concepts. And I would hedge a bet that a Java or a .NET developer would have done some amount of JavaScript, right? So I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, the ease would be anywhere around 6 to 7 for a existing .NET developer to shift to Angular. So does it answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Thank you. So I think that's pretty much it. So I think I should thank everybody for attending the seminar and wish you a great evening.
And yeah.
Any announcement you want to make?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nitin, for your time, and it was indeed a great session. And thank you so much. And those people who are willing to sign up for the upcoming course by Nitin for the AngularJS, I would request them to call up Ennoble Technologies and then give their requirements and their you can actually just drop in here at our office. So I'm just I think Shanmukh, did you mention the details about the address and everything here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you did. Okay, great. So in the chat window you can find our contact details there. So please feel free to.
Do you have a mobile number?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can read out the mobile.
Yeah, the mobile number is 9100625301. I repeat, 9100625301, and the email ID is info@ennoblegrp.com. So for the purpose of I'm actually once again pinging here, so you can get that. Okay. Thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate that. Thank you. Bye bye. Take care.
Yeah,